Rain whispered against slate rooftops as dawn crept into the Highland keep. A raven, ink-black and glistening, landed on the parapet with a parchment sealed in crimson wax. Beneath the thunder of distant hooves and the rustle of servants lighting hearths, the message was quietly delivered to the Lady of Drunford, who read it with trembling fingers before feeding it to the flames. Her husband, Lord Adric, had ridden east to swear fealty to the newly crowned duke, his enemy's son. Now the fog had deepened. The sun did not break through that morning. It strained behind a veil of ash-colored sky, as if reluctant to witness what the day would bring. In the courtyard, stags carved into stone watched with eyeless calm as armored men adjusted stirrups and sharpened blades they were told they wouldn't need. No one spoke of war, but everyone moved like it was coming. In her chamber, Lady Alira sat unmoving. Her veil hung low, a thin gauze between her thoughts and the world. Her daughter, no older than 7 winters, hummed softly as she braided strands of hay into the bone doll's hair. "Why do the bells ring when there is no wedding?" she asked again. Alira gave no answer. Her hands were wrapped around a dagger, gifted years ago by a knight who had kissed her hand only once before vanishing into her father's dungeons. She never learned if he'd begged for her name when the irons broke his knees. Down the corridor, servants stepped lightly. Even their gossip was hushed, like a song half remembered in a storm. They passed the portrait of Lady Ardea, the first of Drunford's widows, whose painted eyes seemed to follow those who carried secrets. In the kitchens, bread rose too slowly. The yeast recoiled in the cold. At midday, the raven's twin arrived. It struck the tower window with enough force to crack the old stained glass, talons skidding over stone. The parchment it carried was damp and unsealed. The ink had run. Alira read only one word before turning away. Broken. She did not descend in haste. She moved like drifting smoke, slow and without apology. Past the armory, past the nursery, down into the crypt carved into the ribs of the mountain itself. The corridor swallowed all light. Her candle hissed with each breath of the tomb. She paused before the effigies, rows of lords with hands in prayer, stone wives beside them, their feet resting on lions, on wolves, on hounds of war. She knelt, wax dripped onto the cold floor as she whispered names no priest recited anymore. "Do you remember," she asked the stone, "what it cost to stay silent?" The candle sputtered. From above came a single sound, the heavy groan of the front gates being barred. She did not return to her chamber. Instead, she stood in the chapel as the sun set behind clouds still unwilling to part. The priest, old and nearly blind, lit incense that stank of mold and forgotten herbs. He spoke the rites of protection, as if it mattered, but his voice trembled. There had been no word from Lord Adric, no rider had returned, no banner had appeared on the eastern road, only the ravens. The Lady of Drunford gathered her household that night. In the great hall, under banners that had changed too many times to carry meaning, she stood tall as the hearth roared behind her. Her voice did not waver, though her hand hidden by velvet sleeves gripped the dagger's hilt. "Loyalty," she said, "is not something written on parchment, nor stitched into flags. It is not a thing granted by crowns. It is born of blood and choice." They watched her, servants, soldiers, old women with cracked lips and boys who had never held a blade in earnest. They watched, and for the first time, saw not the wife of a lord but something older, something elemental. Alira lifted her veil. "The east burns," she said. "And the north stirs." A murmur, fear rising. "If Drunford is to endure, we do not wait for fire to find us." That night, the armory was opened without fanfare. The castle seamstress tore linen into bandages instead of bodices. A scribe copied down the names of every child, hidden in the servant tunnels beneath the kitchens. And in the tower, where the ravens came, Lady Alira wrote a letter of her own. Not to the crowned duke, nor to any ally of her vanished husband, but to the bastard son of a southern outlaw, who had once ridden with the knight who gave her that dagger, and who owed no fealty to any crest. She sealed the parchment with her blood. Drunford did not sleep. The halls breathed like lungs in dread. At dawn, the gates opened not to a lord's return, but to the scream of a lookout boy who'd seen horses with no riders, blood on the saddles. Men sent to escort Lord Adric had returned only their mounts, foaming and wounded, told the tale. No word, only silence. And so, in the cold hours between certainty and siege, Lady Alira stood at the parapet, her daughter at her side, the veil once again drawn. The fog below thickened, swallowing the valley, the road, the forest beyond. The birds did not sing. Even the wind seemed afraid. Below her, the men of Drunford waited for orders. Alira did not speak them aloud. She simply raised one hand. Torches were lit, not in celebration, but preparation. The castle was no longer a keep of feasts and pageants. It had remembered itself, a place built for withstanding betrayal. And somewhere in that mist, a third raven flew. Its wings cut the silence like truth unburied. It carried no message, only blood on its beak. The ink had turned black with cold. In the heart of the monastery, carved into the northern cliffside, Brother Tama's hand hovered above the lambskin, trembling slightly, not from age, but from knowing. A seabird screamed outside, its cry lost to the roaring of waves hurling themselves against the granite, as if trying to claw their way back into forgotten time. In that timeless echo, the chants of morning prayer bled into the stone corridor sweat, echoing, haunted. Tama's quill touched parchment again. Dominus Rex. He wrote it with the care of a prayer, but the reverence was hollow. The name of the king, once whispered in hope beneath candlelit halls, now rested like a curse in the pit of his gut. This was no ordinary decree. This was an execution list, masked in sanctified ink. A purge cloaked in piety. Each name condemned had once knelt with him beneath the same stained glass, drawn breath from the same bread, wept before the same altar. Yet here he sat, copying the king's verdicts, as if they were gospel. As if memory could be scraped clean by script, he blinked. The next name blurred, Abbot Elric. He had once held Tama as a boy trembling in fever, wiping his brow with lavender water, singing psalms until the seizures passed. Now his name would end in a noose, because he had once hidden a prince. The lambskin seemed to shudder under his touch. They had all been loyal, once, loyal to a cause whispered under threat of iron boots, loyal to a child cloaked in blood and humility, smuggled through bramble and snow to this monastery's gates. Tama remembered how the wind had screamed that night, just like now, and how the boy had collapsed into his arms, his breath thick with iron and secrets. They had given him shelter, taught him prayer, given him false robes and new names. A sister had stitched his leg with threads meant for mending vestments. The stable boy had offered up his only shoes. They had bound themselves to a single fragile hope that this boy might one day restore a kingdom of justice, and he had returned. But not as a savior, not as the boy they sheltered. He had returned as fire in the mouth of winter. With eyes like cold steel and proclamations like thunder, he had crowned himself king, not with ceremony, but with the blood of lords and the ashes of abbeys. Tama pressed his knuckles to his temple. The parchment blurred again. He thought of Sister Elaine. Gentle hands that had once laid herbs beneath the boy's bandages. He had seen her taken days ago. No word, no cry, only silence in the chapel where her voice once lifted the psalms. And now her name, too, inked onto this unholy scroll. The chill was no longer from the stone, it was inside him. That evening, at vespers, the monks sang. Their voices rose like moths toward the stained glass windows, where the faces of saints stared down, eyeless and eroded by centuries. The sunset lit the glass in tones of blood and gold, casting their robes in martyr's flame. But there were absences. 2 voices missing, one young, one cracked with age. Tama noticed, so did others, but none spoke. Silence was the last vow they shared. After the final bell, he walked the cloister alone. His sandals whispered across wax-dripped stone. Somewhere deep, the wind howled through a forgotten archway, and he thought he heard the muffled sob of the earth. In the garden, he paused. The air was bitter with salt. There, among the withered yew, a crow hopped near a stone basin, pecking at something small and silver, a ring. Tama knelt slowly. The emblem caught the last of the light. A lion pierced by a sword. The king's house. He lifted it with numb fingers. It had once graced the finger of the boy king's steward. Or perhaps, the boy himself. Had he cast it away in shame, or had it fallen during some quiet struggle? The garden gave no answer. That night, the fire in the scriptorium crackled like bones breaking underfoot. Tama stared at the half-finished decree. The names glared back, stark and silent. He reached for the page. His fingers tore it slowly, with trembling reverence, as though unmaking a curse. Then he fed it to the fire. The flames ate the names hungrily. He stared into them, saw faces: the abbot, the sister, the stable boy dissolving in the orange glow. Not gone, not forgotten, not erased. The next page he drew was blank, pure. A silence ready to be filled, but not with verdicts. With truth. His hand steadied as he dipped the quill. The ink flowed thick, reluctant in the cold, but it came. Let it be known to any eyes that find this parchment. We were once the hands that saved a king. We gave him warmth, bread, the name of peace, and he repaid us with flame. But this is not a record of bitterness. This is a confession that even among monks fear can breed silence, and silence can hang 100 innocents. We should have spoken. We should have run. We should have fought. Forgive us those who vanish without word. We failed you. And to the king, who once we cradled, know that your crown is stitched with the thread of betrayal. He paused. The fire cracked again, softer now. As if in agreement. Outside, the waves fell silent for a moment, like a breath being held. Then came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing along the corridor of the cloister. Tama closed the book, not the decree book, the new one. The one that held only his confession. He slipped it beneath the loose stone beneath his desk, a hiding place as old as the scriptorium itself. He stood, the door creaked open. A hooded figure entered, face unseen, shadow devouring detail. They said nothing. Tama nodded once, and raised his hands, not in surrender, but in peace. The wind rose outside, and a distant bell cracked. The monastery would wake tomorrow, with one more voice missing. But in the stone, the truth would remain, waiting for the next rebellion, for the next silence to be broken. The great hall reeked of ox fat, spilled wine, and the cloying perfume of political marriage. Torches hissed as if in protest, casting erratic shadows that danced upon walls carved with serpents, wolves, and sorrowful vines. In their flickering light, the carved beasts came alive, mocking those who watched with gilded goblets and hollow hearts. A boar's head steamed upon the feast table. Above it, the red bear devoured its embroidered dove, stitched in cruel thread above the high table, and beneath that bleeding emblem sat the bride, still as a gravestone, veiled in silk embroidered with bird sparrows, doves, thrushes, all frozen in flight. She sat unmoving, her lips pressed together like a locked chest, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles shone through skin pale as candle wax. All watched her for signs of refusal. None came. Lord Verson, of Danmere, leaned toward her, his mouth a curl of wine-stained promises. Land, he whispered, sons, and silence. His breath smelled of cloves and decay. His fingers brushed her wrist as if she were already a possession to be counted, sealed, and stowed. He was old enough to remember her mother's wedding. She was young enough to forget what joy had ever meant. Outside, in the snow-slick courtyard, a jester juggled apples for a crowd that laughed too loudly. His smile trembled beneath bells that no longer rang. One apple slipped from his grasp and split on the stone like a skull dropped from the battlements. No one noticed, or perhaps none dared to, but the bride had noticed everything. The night before she had slipped through the frost-laced cloister paths and met her cousin beneath the chapel ruins, where ivy grew through stone like veins through skin. There, in moonlight silver and sorrowful, they had clasped hands, pale fingers tangled like roots, and spoke in the old tongue, no longer welcome in these halls. He gave her a lock of his hair, braided with iron thread. "Hide this," he said, voice low as the crypt beneath them. "Hide this when the fire starts." Now, beneath her veil, that braid pressed cold against her breastbone. The hall surged with revelry, meat torn with hands, goblets tipped, laughter loud and false. Minstrels played the same wedding hymn that echoed through Danmere for 3 generations, a song about loyalty no one believed in. And then came the fire. It began, as all rebellion does, in the hidden places. First, the stable's flames curling like tongues through hay and timber, horses shrieking like betrayed ghosts. Then the pantry where sacks of grain burst and smoked. Then the linen stores, where white sheets ignited like old sins exposed. Smoke thickened in the rafters. A shriek rose from the kitchens. A guard ran in, helm askew, shouting something no one heard over the sudden crush of boots and bodies. By the time the flames reached the western wall, the bride had vanished. Some said she was taken, others claimed she walked, but none saw her leave. Lord Verson overturned benches, shouting orders, his voice cracking beneath the weight of disbelief. "Find her," he roared, but no one knew where to look. His men scattered, some to search, others to flee the rising fire. A tapestry ignited above the hearth, a woven hunt of hounds and deer, and burned like prophecy fulfilled. By dawn, Danmere was ash. The bare sigil was the last to fall, curling into smoke like a curse undone. Lord Verson searched the ruins for days, then weeks, his fingers blistered lifting charred beams, calling into windless mornings. "My lady," he cried to the soot-dark sky, but no veil, no blood, no bones, only the empty altar and a single bird feather, blackened but intact, left where her chair once stood. But tales travel faster than fire. Far to the east, banners had been seen threadbare, but proud, fluttering from a forgotten tower, nestled between frost-bitten pines and rivers iced with memory. And on those banners, the same birds once stitched to her veil, now flew free in golden thread. They said she rode with rebels. They said she wore no crown but carried one in her silence, that her cousin rode beside her, sword at his back, oath at his lips. They called her the Ember Queen. Wherever she moved, smoke followed, not the chaos of arson, but the smoke of something older, sacred fire, reclaimed language, old laws spoken in forest glades, and whispered in the ears of wolves. In the villages once loyal to Danmere, torches burned not in fear but in signal. A flicker on the eastern hills meant safe passage. 2 quick flames in the northern marshes meant provisions ready. The people remembered, even if they pretended not to. Old women drew runes into butter before churning. Children sang lullabies in forgotten cadences. Men once sworn to Verson, now disappeared one by one, and their families wept not with sorrow, but with hope. In the shadows of ruined keeps and thawing woods, something stirred, not armies, not conquest, but return. For this was never about marriage, it was about memory. The kind sewn in thread and blood, carried in a lock of hair, passed hand to hand across generations, silenced by war and treaties, signed in ash. And the bride once motionless beneath a veil of birds had become legend. The kind mothers warned daughters not to follow, and daughters did anyway. Lord Verson died one winter later, alone, raving, fingers still black with soot, clutching a scorched ribbon he claimed was hers. They buried him beneath the charred beams of his hall. No songs were sung, no banners lowered, but far away, in a tower lit by candles carved with ancient glyphs, a girl stood in shadow, watching snow fall through broken arches. A man beside her whispered, "It begins." She did not smile, she did not speak, she only stepped forward, her boots silent on the stone, and reached out to touch a tapestry being woven anew, birds in gold, a bear chained, a dove flying free. Outside, the wind rose. Somewhere, in the west, another torch was lit. and the silence before the storm tasted of iron and ash. Snow fell in hushed spirals over the battlefield, long after the screaming had ceased. The fog did not lift, it thickened, as though the sky itself mourned. Crows stitched the silence with black threads of flight, drifting between limbs frozen in death. Iron helms gathered frost, like old tears. The scent of blood had grown cold, mingling with the wet copper stink of churned soil and spent men. Beneath a broken standard half buried in snow, a girl moved like a ghost through yesterday's war. She was small, too small for the scale of the ruin, but she walked with the stillness of something ancient. Usbit, barefoot, wrapped in a torn banner heavy with her father's blood. The cloth dragged behind her like a wounded thing. She did not cry. Her tears had frozen in her throat when the gallows creaked. The dead were many, and she gave them names. She knelt beside a knight whose visor was jammed shut with dried mud. Aldrich, she whispered, as if naming him stitched a soul to memory. To a fallen standard-bearer with a severed arm, Jonah, a woman with braided hair, still clasping a broken dagger, Saria. She named those she knew, and those she didn't. Each name a prayer, each name a stone in her chest. A raven cawed from the belly of a dead horse, then took flight. The child did not flinch. Her eyes, gray and wind-scoured, held the storm like a mirror. She was looking for one thing. She found him as the light turned gold-soft, deceptive, like the warmth of a candle burning over a grave. Her father lay face down, half buried by trampled banners. His back was a thicket of arrows, stiff with ice. His sword was gone. His gauntlets torn, but his signet ring, the one he had refused to yield, still clung to his gloved hand like the last defiant breath of a name once honored. She knelt, her fingers, raw and blue, pulled at the glove. It would not come. She found a shard of armor, and cut it free. Wrapped in her scarf, the ring pulsed against her chest, like a heart not yet convinced of death. The victorious lit fires on the hills. Their camp hummed with laughter and steel, but their torches dared not step into the valley of bones. That dusk belonged to the dead and the girl. By the time the scavengers came, grave diggers with rusted hooks, mothers in veils, pushing creaking carts, priests who muttered benedictions from behind wet sleeves. Usbit was already gone. They would have seen only the ruin, only the silence. She had returned to the abbey. It had once housed songs, a place of painted saints and honey-sweet prayers. Now the icons hung tilted and cracked, their eyes smeared with soot. The wounded moaned beneath makeshift roofs of splintered beams. Snow melted on altar stones. No one asked her name. The monks fed her broth with hands that trembled. They scrubbed the dried blood from her cheeks with cloths dipped in wine and salt. They believed her to be an orphan. They were half right. She slept beneath the shattered gaze of a saint with a missing face. She woke to the coughing of men too stubborn to die, and each day, she watched. Her blade, taken from a fallen squire, lived in her boot. The ring lived in her sleeve. She spoke little, but she listened to whispered names, passed between guards, listened to the ones who had commanded the charge, listened for the man who had pulled the gallows rope taut, and she remembered. The betrayal had not come with shouting. It had come with a nod across the fire, a coin exchanged beneath a tent flap. Her father had known, but he had charged anyway. Not for glory, not for redemption, for her. And now she carried the weight of his final gift like a blade under the ribs, unseen, but always felt. She was not a prophet. There were no omens, only footsteps in the frost, only memories that refused to rot. Usbit waited. She helped gather bandages. She stirred the porridge. She fetched water with hands blistered from cold. And all the while, she mapped the faces of the abbey. One night, beneath a bleeding moon, a knight in black sat by the fire, laughing with wine-slick lips. His pauldron bore the crest of the company that had betrayed the charge. He did not notice her. She did not speak, but she watched where he laid his gloves, watched where his dagger fell. The wind howled through the rafters like a distant scream, remembered too late. The abbey bell had not tolled in weeks, its rope had frayed, its tongue lay cracked on the floor, but Usbit rang it once in her mind, when the knight stumbled to the latrine, humming a bawdy tune from a forgotten coast. He did not return. By dawn, a monk found his body near the stables, no wounds, no struggle, his eyes open to a heaven that had long since stopped watching. They said it was a seizure. The cold, the wine, they buried him without a name. Usbit stitched another name into her scarf that night, not for vengeance fulfilled, not yet, for practice. Winter deepened, the wounded thinned, the monks whispered of retreating south, to warmer halls, to cities still wrapped in peace, but Usbit remained. Her silence was her shadow, her eyes the slow blade of justice yet to be drawn. Revenge, like winter, was not fast, it was patient, and in the quiet decay of the abbey, in the breathless pause between battles, something ancient stirred, not prophecy, not destiny, only a girl in a ruin, holding a ring, and remembering. The candlelight stuttered. It flickered, not from draught, but as if the very stone walls held their breath. In the great hall of Caelwyn Keep, built upon the raised bones of an ancient pagan shrine, Duke Almeric raised a silver chalice toward the rafters. The wine within was dark as blood, spiced thick with cloves and iron. The feast was loud, boisterous, but the laughter rang hollow, each burst echoing a little too long, like shouts in a crypt. The meats were still steaming, veal crusted with rosemary, goose dripping fat into scorched trenchers. Yet only the hounds devoured freely. The men, his vassals, smiled with careful teeth, their glances skittered like insects, their hands hovered too long over blades, and beside Almeric, his sons Tharo, grim-jawed and ash-pale, Emric, younger, eyes darting like a thief's, spoke only when addressed, their words dry as parchment. His wife, Lady Helene, sat veiled in silk, the color of grave dust. Her fingers moved not in idle prayer, but in warfare, rubbing the rosary like a whetstone. Her lips mouthed Latin blessings, but her eyes were fixed on the fire, where the logs hissed and spat, sparks that looked far too much like bones. Earlier that day, a huntsman had not returned. At dawn, they'd found him, his throat opened from ear to chin, his eyes staring toward heaven, but it was not his death that chilled the air. It was the message, carved into the bark of an ancient oak, clawed as if by antlers or knives. The forest remembers, a phrase older than the church, older than the duke's line, whispered in the elder tongue, back when the moon was worshipped, not as symbol, but as sister, when the standing stones sang beneath moss and shadow, when men bowed not to God, but to grove and ghost, and Duke Almeric. He had silenced them. He had burned the druids in cages woven from holly and ash. He had chopped the sacred trees for firewood, carved the stones into steps. He had salted the roots, so that nothing would ever rise again. But something had remembered. Malyn knew. She stood at the edge of the feast, apart, as always. While her brothers sharpened ambition, and their father sharpened fear, Malyn studied silence. She wore a gown black as crow feathers, though no funeral had been declared. Her sleeves were long, stitched with faded thread and secret purpose. Inside, a scroll pressed against her skin, warmed by blood and belief. Her mother had taught her the letters of Rome, the tongue of law and scripture, but her grandmother, buried in a field unblessed, beneath a stone with no name, had taught her something else. The old marks, curved like rivers, sharp as thorns, a script not meant to be read, but followed, and on the scroll names of the vanished, the midwives who knew too much herb, the smith's wife who sang to the moon, the child who dreamed of wolves and woke with dirt under his nails. One by one, they had disappeared, taken by decree, silenced by steel. But Malyn wrote them back into the world, into ink, into memory. At the table, the Duke raised a toast to the enduring order, and the wind outside rang not with bells, but with bone. The servants heard it first, a hush beneath the storm, chimes not made of silver, but of knuckle and copper, strung high in trees where no hand had climbed. They trembled not with breeze, but with breath. Lady Helene crossed herself. Tharrow's goblet trembled. Emmerich stared too long at the meat, as if afraid it might stare back. Almeric laughed. Let the dead rattle their toys, he bellowed, draining the wine. They are bones, we are flesh. But Malin did not drink. Her eyes lingered on the guest, show they left early, hands clasped too tightly behind backs. How the steward made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers. How the dogs refused to enter the shadow of the western corridor. At midnight, she slipped from her chamber. No shoes, no guards, only a candle and silence. The corridors whispered as she passed, tapestries rustling like breath against ear. Down the servants' stair, through the kitchen where onions wept and knives hung unused, past the chapel, where a crucifix swung slightly, though the air was still. The forest greeted her like a cathedral, tall trunks blackened by rain, moss glowing faint as embers. Mist hugged the earth in coils, her breath came like prayer, and in her other hand, the scroll, bound now in linen, soaked crimson. Her blood, her offering. She walked for what felt like hours, but the forest told her than any clock measured time in heartbeat and hush. At last, she found it, the hollow ash, dead, but not fallen, blackened by lightning years ago, yet still standing. A wound in the bark, gaped like a mouth. She knelt, placed the scroll inside, folded it with care, as one would tuck in a child. Then she wrapped it in the shawl, pressed it into the hollow, and whispered, "Let the roots remember." The wind stopped, the trees held still, no leaves rustled, no owl called, no twig snapped, and then something deeper, not a voice, but a shift, a drawing in, like breath held by the land itself, a knowing. Somewhere in the dark, a deer lifted its head and bolted. Somewhere, a hound began to howl, long low note, almost human. Malin did not run, she stood slowly. A thin trickle of blood ran down her wrist, from where she had bound the scroll. It dripped to the earth. The soil drank it. She turned and walked back. Behind her, in the hollow of the ash, the roots stirred, not movement as of wind, not creature or crawl, but memory. Memory turning like a millstone beneath the earth. Stones older than the castle trembled faintly. Somewhere far off, beneath a chapel floor, a forgotten sigil glowed for the first time in generations. Back in the keep, Duke Almeric dreamed of fire. In his sleep, he saw a tree with antlers, a child with eyes like the moon, a woman with no face, only hands made of smoke. He woke screaming, and outside, dawn touched the tower tips with red. But it was Malin who watched the sunrise. She sat upon the battlements, black gown fluttering like a banner. Her fingers traced the carvings in the stone, Roman letters, chiseled firm. She waited for the ones beneath to answer, and they would. They always did. Fog wrapped the coastal village like a shroud, spun by the gods themselves, dampening every sound but the moan of the sea. It was not silence. It was a smothering, as if the air had forgotten how to breathe. Ships had not returned in weeks. Their masts, once proud silhouettes on the horizon, were now memories whispered over salted fishbones. On the docks, nets clung to rotting timbers like spiderwebs of despair. Flies buzzed around forgotten baskets, and salt crusted the lips of children who no longer cried from hunger, only watched with dull, storm-colored eyes. The chapel, once a beacon of bells and balm, stood like a tomb. Its priest, a man with more shadow than soul, now locked the doors not to protect relics, but to hide the altar's emptiness. No incense, no wafer, only dust and dread remained. On the outskirts, where land met brine and memory, stood a hut stitched from driftwood, bone and sin. There lived Edric, a knight once, a blade-bearer, now a ghost with skin. His armor hung above the hearth like a crucifix, made of regressed flaking like dried blood, each dent a scar. No story dared tell. They called him coward, kingslayer, oathbreaker. He answered to none. He spent his days in silence, carving nothing into nothing, until one dawn, a knock shattered the stillness. A boy, bruised, barely 10. His eyes were too old for his bones. "They've taken her," he said, words brittle in the cold. My sister, for tribute. Edric said nothing. He only turned back to the fire, but the boy followed with a hand outstretched, in it a ribbon, faded pink, frayed at the edges. Edric stared. It was the same ribbon his daughter wore the day the city of Calthorn burned. The day Edric ran, the king's secret heavy in his saddle, while his home turned to ash and screams. He had buried his daughter's bones with his honor, but not the memory. That night, when the stars refused to shine, Edric unearthed his sword. The blade sang a cracked, forgotten note as he drew it from its burial. He polished it with seawater and wool, whispering names with each stroke: his daughter's, his wife's, his own, as if incanting penance. The hilt, once wrapped in royal blue, now bore a band of old leather rebound, not for glory, but for revenge. Before dawn, barefoot, he walked toward the keep. Each step sank into mud and memory. Each breath tasted of iron and salt. The road was empty but for gulls and ghosts. By the time he reached the gates of the stone keep, the sun still cowered behind clouds. No guards challenged him, no arrows loosed, just stone, moss, and the faint scent of smoke. He did not knock, did not shout. He knelt, and began to sing. An old soldier's hymn, sung in the trenches of the old wars, when men bled for banners now eaten by moths. His voice cracked like old wood, but he sang, of honor lost, of daughters stolen, of gods who turned their backs. Above him, torches flared, casting jagged shadows down the wall like broken spears, but the gates did not open. And still he sang. Inside the keep, a girl ran barefoot through stone corridors. Her hands trembled, her dress torn. A door had been left open, a cell unlatched. Whether by mercy or mistake, she did not stop to ask. Only fled. Outside, the song faltered. Then silence. Edric lay in the mud, breath shallow, blood black against his side. The sword was by his hand, not in it. Yet his face held peace, a smile, not of victory, but release. From the walls no one descended. No horn blew, no earl appeared to claim the body of the man once called Oathbreaker. But the girl reached the trees. And somewhere, in the bones of the earth, an oath stirred. They buried Edric by the sea. No name carved, only a sword driven into the sand above his grave, like a monument to memory. The villagers did not speak his name, but they left offerings: a child's ribbon, a carved wooden horse, a shell polished to a mirror's shine. The sea took none of it, as if even the tide mourned. And then, something changed. No more daughters vanished. No more tribute carts rolled inland. No more messengers came down the hills, but neither did the earl. The keep stood silent, windows dark, its gate unmoved. Travelers said it looked abandoned, others said it breathed. Some claimed to hear weeping behind the stones, others saw torches flicker to life at dusk, though no hand was seen to light them. The truth, no one dared find out. Instead, they told stories, around hearths, and in hidden chapels, of the knight who sang instead of fought, of the girl who ran, of the gods who might still listen if the song was old enough and the pain deep enough. And beneath it all, a whisper lingered, that Edric had not died for revenge. He had died to remind them that silence is a choice, and so is song. And the sea, ever listening, sang back with every wave. Thunder rolled through the Pyrenees, like the growl of gods old and forgotten. At the spine of the world, 3 riders crested the ridge, dark figures against a sky stitched with lightning. Their cloaks clung to them, sodden and heavy, and their horses sloshed through sucking mire, breath steaming in the mountain cold. One rider bore a satchel bound in wolfskin. It hung like a relic of darker times, thudding softly against his side with each lurch of the saddle. He never touched it, not directly, as if the thing inside could burn through leather and bone. The scroll it carried had once lain beneath the Pope's own ringed hand. Its wax seal was red, thick and cruel, pressed with the golden bull god's sanction and a queen's death writ on lambskin. Queen Isolde of Aragon, a name now whispered with reverence and resentment alike. She had ruled from a throne, forged of yew and hammered iron. her hands scarred not by labor, but by the weight of justice delivered. Her hair was always braided in mourning, a widow's crown, though her husband the king still walked the earth, drunk on war and distant lands. Her subjects called her saint and serpent in the same breath. Assassins had failed, chalices turned to poison had shattered before lips ever touched them. 5 famines had ravaged the land, and still she fed her people, and always the church watched with clenched teeth, as her favor bent toward the poor, not the pulpit. Now twilight encroached, not just on her reign but on the bones of old loyalties. A bastard nephew, bred of noble lies and cloaked ambition, had declared divine right through veins laced with counterfeit sanctity, and Rome listened. And Rome sent 3 riders, but Sir Corvan, once a sentinel of Isolda's throne room, rode slower than the rest. His eyes scanned more than the trail ahead, his thoughts lingered not on duty, but memory. He had stood guard at her wedding, his armor then unscuffed, his spirit unweathered. He remembered the moment when she turned at the altar, and the veil slid from her cheek. A single tear had glittered there, caught in the lamplight of the cathedral. She wiped it before any man saw. But Corvan had seen. She had known, even then, what power cost, how love becomes ransom, how faith is a torch pressed into the palm. The rain thickened as they descended toward Mirenwood, a valley choked with mist and old rumors. Trees twisted there, like hands in pain, their bark carved with forgotten tongues. No birds sang, no path welcomed them. Corvan feigned a break in his spur, a shriek of metal on rock, a groan of a mount, and he pulled back. The others cursed, impatient, and thundered ahead. He turned east, into the belly of fog, into the forest that forgot men's names but remembered their bones. The mist swallowed him whole. Leaves slicked with dew brushed his shoulders like silent warnings, branches gnarled and clawed. Somewhere distant, a bell rang though there was no village, no monastery, no soul to ring it, only the memory of rituals long buried. Corvan dismounted, mud sucked at his boots. Beneath the shelter of an ancient ash, he knelt, the satchel trembled in his hands, not from movement, but from memory. The seal broke with a crack like brittle ice. He read the scroll once, then again, then he whispered, no. From his cloak he drew a single silver thread, bound within it, a lock of dark hair, braided as Isolde wore it. He kissed it once, then with flint and shivering fingers, he set fire to the parchment. It burned slowly, rain hissed against flame, smoke curled upward like a soul released. He buried the ashes in the earth, and pressed the lock of hair into the wet dirt. And there he whispered a vow. May her enemies rot beneath stone, may her name echo beyond crowns and crusades. Far behind him, his companions galloped toward the palace empty-handed, dry-eyed, their lies already formed on trembling tongues. Queen Isolde sat upon her throne when they arrived, her court buzzed like wasps around rot. She listened as they spun their tale. Ambush, disappearance, God's will lost in the woods. She did not flinch, did not blink. Her eyes, gray as winter rivers, pierced them. She knew. That night, she summoned a monk too old for politics and too blind to read lips. She spoke a law aloud, unrecorded, then wrote it, signed it not with name, but with blood. The seal bore no crown, only a sword broken at the hilt. It was to be opened only when her kingdom was fire and her name outlawed. She placed it beneath the stone of her bedchamber, where no priest or prince would think to look, and she waited. In the years that followed, the court whispered of how her gaze grew distant, as if she listened to thunder others could not hear. She walked more often in gardens than in councils, but her laws grew sharper, her judgment swifter. Peasant rebellions were quelled, not by sword, but bread. Nobles who plotted found their titles dissolved like sugar in wine. Corvan returned not to court, but to the shadowed corners of the realm, a knight no longer, but a whisper in the forest paths. Some said he became a monk, others, a ghost who guarded lost roads. None knew the truth, only Isolde. On winter nights, when the wind howled through iron lattices and the fire guttered low, she would glance eastward, toward the Mirenwood, and though her lips never moved, her eyes would soften. She was waiting, not for death, but for the moment when all would burn, when the bastard nephew would rise with armies and scripture, when the Pope's wrath would flood the land in smoke and sermon, and then the law beneath stone would be unsealed. But for now, the scroll was ash, the hair was buried, and the queen still reigned. Somewhere in the forests of a fading kingdom, the mist thinned for just a moment. A stag stepped onto the path, its antlers shadowed with moss. It looked east, then vanished into the trees. The old gods, it was said, do not speak often, but when they do, they answer fire with silence, and silence with vengeance.